Episode 41. I will endure hell if it's for you.
Don't forget what happened to Venna, your twin siblings, Leanne, and all of the other people that had sacrificed themselves for you.
Arya reminded him over and over again about the demise of the people that Cain loved and how it was all because of Iris's father. Arya hugged him even tighter this time and didn't want to let go even when Cain's body stiffened as he hated to be touched. All the touches that he knew in these past 10 years disgusted him greatly.
Don't forget what I had to go through for you, and what Nathan and Jace had to endure to keep you safe, what Gerald had done to us.
Arya lifted her head and then looked at Cain with her teary eyes.
After what her father had done, how could you treat her so nicely?
Cain's expression remained the same as he listened to what she was saying, but he patted her back when she started crying in order to give her consolation.
You treat her so nicely, giving her a room and taking care of her. People have become agitated because you helped her and didn't put her through the same misery like us.
Arya became emotional.
You even helped her to escape from the party. How could you do that to the daughter of the person that had given us hell for years? Have you forgotten about what happened?
I have not forgotten what happened.
Cain patted her back and let Arya rest her head on his chest as he let her slide her hand under his clothes and tempt him. He could feel her hand against his chest. Arya made sure that he didn't forget about it at all. This was their past. This was their revenge, and he must not forget.
Do you remember that day at the mines? When you were not allowed to rest or given food or water? They literally wanted to starve you to death.
Arya could see the memory return to Cain.
Do you remember that moment?
I will never forget that.
Cain's cold demeanor disappeared. There was a little bit of warmth in his eyes when he stared at Arya's face.
On the third day, under the scorching sun, you could barely move.
Arya ran her hands down his belly and back to his chest again.
Do you remember what happened to little Venna? She is still not back to her right mind after what they had done to her, after what you have done to her.
Arya took a deep breath. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Cain's body stiffened when he heard her mentioning Venna. That was a big scar that he would never forget. She tried to kill you for a mistake you didn't have a part in. Cain remembered that day clearly, like it just happened yesterday, and it erased all the coldness in his eyes, replacing it with pain. It was me who bandaged your wounds. It was me and Ami who told you to keep strong and not give up. I was there for you, and I am always here beside you. We have gone through so much together, Cain. We have gone through hell together, and that hell was given by Gerald. This time, Cain hugged her, and Arya felt relieved, since it was not every day that he would let anyone so close to him like this. He despised close contact if it was not for his carnal needs. Even so, he would always keep distance. And here, Cain started to reiterate those words that had been killing him inside. Only if he was stronger, only if he could do something right, his people wouldn't have had to suffer such agony. Gerald had died. Cain had killed him. But what he left him with, the helpless feeling that he inflicted on him, would forever be there. Even after he took back his pack and was in the alpha position, the feeling didn't go away. It would always hunt him down.
What happened to Venna is not your fault, Cain. Never your fault.
Arya knew how to aggravate him. She knew everything that could stir his anger, open his wounds all over again. She knew what words to say. She was the one who brought back the demons from his past, but then she would soothe him after she wounded him. Arya had this urge to kiss him. Even after 3 years of them being together, not even once did he allow her to kiss him, nor would he do that himself. However, she couldn't push Cain further than this, since she had already driven him to the edge. In the end, Arya unbuckled his leather pants and freed his phallus. She ran her fingers through the rough skin of it. The incessant scalding left horrible scars on his manhood, and he could have died because of it if it was not for his elfish blood that coursed through his veins.
I want you, Cain. I only want you. I will go through hell over and over again for you, because it's only you that I want.
Arya looked at him pleadingly as she lowered her head and took him deep inside her mouth until he hit the back of her throat. Arya was kneeling in front of him, pleasuring him, soothing him. She gently ran her tongue on the coarse tissue of his phallus. She felt powerful whenever she took him like this, as she sucked him hard and he groaned. She loved to hear how she affected him. Cain held her head there as he prodded her hips for her to take him deeper. He wanted to forget everything and let this woman make him stop thinking. Cain groaned. His eyes became darker as he stared at her. Arya used her hand to caress his butt, rubbing her fingers up and down. With a pop, she let out his phallus and sucked on her thumb instead, before she resumed her action and used her lubricated thumb to penetrate his asshole. Cain let out a dangerous growl and started fucking her mouth roughly. Episode 42. His mark on her skin. Arya liked it when Cain allowed her to do this, and she was glad to let him take pleasure from her body. Cain groaned, and suddenly, he pulled away and lifted Arya up as he tossed her onto the bed. He turned around her body and pushed the pillow under her stomach so her ass would be up in the air. Cain sucked his thumb the same way Arya did and pushed it deeper into her hole, which made her shriek, but she adjusted to it quickly. From behind, Cain sneaked his hand to her breast and pulled on her nipple harder as she cried in pain. But it was not enough for Cain. He wanted her to hurt more. Thus, he thrust his finger deeper in her back and muffled her scream by covering her mouth and nose. He literally suffocated her, which made her whole body shudder from the lack of air. Arya couldn't breathe. She thrashed her body and tried to push him away, but he didn't budge. Instead, Cain bit down on her shoulder. This time, he pulled out his thumb and thrust deeper all of a sudden, which caused blood to drip from her hole. Arya felt lightheaded. The pain was too much, and she could feel how distraught he was from how rough he was with her. He did her raw. There was certainly no relationship between them to begin with, aside from this carnal desire. Cain had warned her, but she didn't care. He had told her that she could die during their copulation. Thus, he tried his best to tone it down. But Arya always did the opposite and provoked him at every chance she got. Arya didn't have any strength left as she couldn't breathe. But before she could black out, Cain released his hand that covered her mouth and nose. Instead, he rubbed her clit and started fingering her. He didn't give time for her to adjust when he thrust 2 fingers inside, and now she felt so full. He did her from behind, but he used his fingers too at the same time. Arya found it hard to breathe, even though Cain was no longer covering her mouth and nose when her climax hit her hard. She was breathless when she screamed her release. Her body shuddered for a long time. The pleasure was so painful. But Cain was not satisfied yet. He had not yet found his release, and the longer it took, the more painful this was for both of them. Arya was half-conscious when Cain pulled out and turned her body around, and now her sweaty back was pressed to the bed as she was facing the alpha now. He thrust it deep inside her as she emitted a long, soft groan when he worked his way inside her. He pulled back and shoved all the way into her again as he started to fuck her roughly as usual. His hands pressed her hips to the mattress, holding her captive to take his brutal thrusts. It didn't take long for Arya to be on the very edge of her climax again. The pleasure washed over her. Cain literally drained her. When Arya tilted her head to look at Cain, her eyes caught Iris, who was standing stupefied behind the door that was slightly ajar, and she smirked at her. From this position, Cain wouldn't be able to see Iris, because he had his back to her and his whole focus was on the woman beneath him. On the other hand, Iris happened to go out of her bedroom just when they were fucking each other, while Arya was being so loud and made it clear what the alpha was doing to her. However, Iris couldn't hear that, but she was sure that she was being loud. Her cheeks heated. She turned her head and stared at Ami, who was in the room along with her. She was mortified to witness such activity and how brutal the alpha was when he drew pleasure from this woman. But Ami didn't seem bothered by that. She had gone through so much, heard too many noises, and had seen enough. When you were a slave under Gerald's mercy, this kind of noise was an everyday occurrence. At the very least, both of them consented to this. While in the slavery, they would wonder whether their friends or family members would survive the sexual abuse that they were put through. However, Iris wasn't used to that, and it baffled her how ignorant Ami was to hear all that with a straight face. She didn't even flinch or feel awkward.
Come here,
Ami said, and Iris saw her waving her hand for her to come over, and she snapped out of her daze as she went straight to her.
I will apply the ointment on your wound and rebandage it again. After that, you can take a rest here until the alpha tells you otherwise.
Iris nodded, though she missed half of what she was saying, as her mind was so distracted by the image of the alpha and his mistress. He took her roughly, almost brutally. If it was her? Iris shuddered at the thought. Did he do that to her that night? She was sure that he was holding back at that time, because the intensity was so different when he took her, though it didn't make it less painful for her, since it was her first time.
After I finish this, you need to take your medicine and get as much rest as you can.
Ami applied the ointment and then brewed her some herbal tea. Taking a big gulp of her tea, which tasted so spicy, Iris felt better as sleepiness came over her. Iris didn't know when Ami took her leave, but when she woke up again, it was already dark. Night had fallen, and she was alone in this dark room. She pushed herself to sit down and held her head. The headache was not as bad as before, but she was aware of her predicament. She remembered clearly what she had seen that night and was sure that was something forbidden for her to know. Now, she feared for her life. Slowly, Iris got out of her bed and made her way out of this room. But she needed to go through the alpha's bedroom first before she could get out to the hallway. Iris thought, since it was late at night, the alpha would have gone to sleep, and she could sneak out of this room without him noticing it. But she was so wrong about it, because there he was, sitting behind his table, holding a few documents in his hand, while his eyes were fixed on her. Probably he heard the creaking sound from the door, and this attracted his attention. Iris lowered her head. She was not sure whether she must return back to the room or something. But then, from the corner of her eyes, she saw movement. The alpha called her over, and she didn't have any other choice but to go to him. Slowly, she strode across the room and approached Kane.
Master.
Iris said in a low voice. She almost slipped and called him Alpha when he made sure he was not the alpha for her. Kane stared at the auburn-haired girl for a moment, and the silence was so terrifying for Iris. After that, he stood up and walked toward her. His hand stretched out, and he pulled the bandage wrapped around her neck open. His eyes darkened when he saw her slender neck, where his mark on her skin was glaring back at him. Episode 43. The Amount of Pain. Kane heard the creaking sound of the door and saw Iris staring at him with a complicated expression on her pale face. She lowered her head and fiddled with her fingers, not knowing what to do. For a moment, Kane just stared at her with a stoic expression. He still had not yet decided what he was going to do with her now that the situation became even more complicated than he had intended it to be. This gave him another headache to kill his brain cells over.
Come here.
Kane narrowed his eyes when he saw she didn't move an inch. and then remembered that she couldn't hear him. He waved his hand to beckon her over. Iris saw the movement from the corner of her eyes and walked toward him slowly. She was mortified when the alpha raised his hand and wrapped his fingers around her neck as his eyes darkened to see his mark on her skin. At this moment, Iris still did not realize about the mark on her. She thought she was bitten by the monster, and the fact that she might be marked didn't even cross her mind. However, Kane saw it, and he was not happy at all to see his mark on her. His enemy's daughter? Gerald's laugh kept ringing in his head, sounding like he was mocking him all over again for marking his daughter. He would roll over in his grave, laughing over how stupid he was.
Master?
Iris held his hand when his fingers tightened around her neck. He was trying to choke her, and the realization made her panic, especially when she could see the hostility in his dark eyes. With his strength, he would be able to crush her neck easily. Iris gasped for air, but her airway was blocked, and she started to claw at his hand, leaving marks there. But it healed within a second. He didn't feel any pain from it, not even in the slightest. And when Iris's face turned red and the pain became more unbearable, as she thought she would die from strangulation, Kane finally let her go. Her legs became so weak as she dropped to the floor, coughing fervently. Her neck was in pain and her ears kept ringing. She gulped the air greedily to fill her empty lungs, but then she coughed even harder. Her whole body was trembling in fear. Iris wanted to move away from him, yet she couldn't bring herself to do so when she didn't have strength to stand up or even carry herself away. She flinched and whimpered when Kane hunkered down in front of her. His eyes were still emotionless, watching her in pain. He waited until Iris stopped coughing. It took a long time for her to be able to breathe normally. Kane pinched her chin to tilt her head up so she could see his face and read his lips, for he had a question to ask.
What were you doing in that hut?
That was not an unpredictable question, since Iris knew that he would ask about it sooner or later, but she doubted that he would accept her answer.
I heard a howl.
Kane narrowed his eyes.
You can't hear.
Iris knew he wouldn't believe that because she didn't believe it either. It had been years since the last time she heard anything aside from her own voice in her mind.
But I heard it.
She insisted. She didn't know what kind of lie that she could offer. So it would be better if she told him the truth, since Kane looked like someone who would be able to sniff a lie from miles away.
I heard a howl and followed the sound of it.
Why?
Iris could understand why it was hard to believe her explanation. If she were in his shoes, she wouldn't believe herself either. Why would she follow the sound of that howl? Normally, the first instinct that came to your mind was to run away from such an unknown howl. Howls like that must be coming from a beast, and someone like her, a runt, who knew nothing about protecting herself, should seek for a shelter, not the other way around. Iris tried to explain herself the best way she could, but she knew it was not convincing enough for Kane.
Do you know what happened to you then?
Kane's voice became so much darker. Iris nodded.
Yes.
Her voice was small. It was filled with dread when the events of that night rushed to her mind once again. She still remembered how she thought she would die when the monster pounced onto her and shifted back into its human form.
What have you seen?
Iris swallowed, but it hurt her throat tremendously. She felt like she was eating sand that grazed her gullet.
A monster chained to the wall with silver chains, and then...
She avoided his intense gaze when she spoke again.
I saw the monster shift into its human form before he bit me.
Her whole body was trembling when she remembered that moment. That was the most terrifying moment in her life, aside from when Mason whipped her when he was drunk.
And then? What else?
His voice was akin to Glacier's.
The monster.
Iris lowered her head. She was so afraid to say this out loud.
The monster shifted into a man, and it was you.
Iris could feel the tension building up once she let those words out. Would he hit her? Would he choke her to death like he did earlier? Would he kill her for knowing what was supposed to be a secret? Probably Kane would have done that if he didn't accidentally mark her. He marked her without her consent. More so, he didn't have control over what he was doing at that time. Her scent drove the monster crazy, and her touch felt like fresh water that soothed his pain, and he wanted more, because the pain wrecked him and it was unbearable. But Kane didn't mean for that to happen. However, he couldn't kill her now of all times since the bond between them started to form already. This was a lost cause for him.
Was it you?
Iris wanted to make sure that her fear didn't cloud her mind and she saw something that didn't even exist. Iris raised her head and looked at him closely. She was sure that she could see a murderous intention flashing in the back of those dark eyes, as if his beast would come forward and rip her apart. She shuddered involuntarily and dropped her head as she stuttered.
I promise I will not say anything about that night. I swear, I will not utter a single word.
Iris shook her head.
I will do anything you tell me to do.
Her throat was killing her, and she was afraid. Besides being unable to hear, she would soon be unable to speak. The pain from his strangulation was so severe, but she was afraid to show it, since she was in a position where she couldn't upset the alpha even more than this. Once again, Kane put his finger under her chin and tilted her head up so she could look at him.
Do you know what else happened that night?
Iris was confused with the question as she searched in her memories about the dreadful night, but she couldn't find anything aside from what she had told him.
I don't know what else happened. I lost consciousness.
Iris was still visibly trembling, especially when Kane grabbed her hand all of a sudden and forced her to stand up. He dragged her to the other side of the room. The grip was so tight, she was sure that he would leave bruises on her wrist, but that was the least of her concerns, because things could go so bad for her, so much more than suffering a few bruises. But Kane stopped and then made her stand in front of the mirror as he pulled down her collar, which made Iris recoil out of instinct. But the alpha steadied her first and made her stand there firmly. Kane pulled aside her curly auburn hair and made her look at her own reflection in the mirror. At first, Iris could only see a pale, skinny girl with big blue eyes, which looked so big and out of proportion for her face staring back at her. Her auburn hair was messy. Her curls made her head look so big. She didn't see herself as a beauty, and that was what her brother always told her. But then, her eyes trailed down to her neck, since Kane pulled her collar down to let her see what was there, and Iris gasped. She was shocked to see a mark on her neck. She knew what a mark like this meant to shifters. She had seen it herself, and how sacred a mark was. But how? How could she get this mark? And the realization dawned on her, which made her stagger back. But Kane held her, so she could face this reality.
Impossible.
Iris would have never thought that getting that bite from the monster would be a marking process.
How can this happen?
Iris turned her body around and then faced Kane.
Why?
Kane felt aggravated by the question, but it didn't show on his expression.
I don't want a single soul to know about this.
His voice was so low and cold. It emanated danger. The tension was so heavy it made Iris feel like he strangled her again.
Not a single soul will learn about this and what happened that night.
Iris nodded. She knew that she had to clamp her mouth shut the moment she learned a secret that she shouldn't know.
Say something about this, and I will throw you to those savages, for them to take pleasure from you until your last breath.
Iris felt her eyes sting with tears and fear. She nodded again and immediately covered her neck with her long curly hair. She didn't want to die in that way. That was a horrible way to meet your demise. There was one time in the past when she sneaked out of her room in the middle of the night and saw how her brother ordered 10 savages to rape Will. Kane's personal guard at present, and the image would never go away from her mind. She couldn't hear Will let out endless, earth-shattering screams, but she could feel it when he saw the anger and desperation in his eyes. They had freed themselves from the slavery, but no one would be able to recover fully from what happened, from the hell that they had gone through, and that was understandable. What they had gone through was so severe. It was beyond your worst nightmare, and it dragged on for years. People who still stood strong and didn't break during all those hellish days would never be normal.
Understood.
Iris nodded. She tried to hold back her tears. Her brother always told her that she upset him more when she was crying. Thus, she didn't want to do that.
Leave now.
Kane didn't want to see her. She gave him another trouble that he didn't want to face. Meanwhile, reading that, Iris immediately rushed out of the bedroom. Her legs almost gave way, but she willed herself to be at least on the other side of the door before she broke down. She didn't want Kane to change his mind and punish her later. On the other hand, after Kane heard the door being closed, he broke down. He fell to his knees and covered his face with both of his hands. His shoulders trembled. The realization that he had marked another girl wrecked him. It felt like an insult to Lycan, to his destined mate. He felt horrible. More so, it was the girl that he was supposed to hate to death. There were no tears. He couldn't cry, but the pain shook his whole body. This amount of pain suffocated him. He felt like he had betrayed his dead mate. Episode 44. There is a cure. Hannah was shocked to see a battered Iris walk into the bedroom in the middle of the night. She looked haggard, shaking like a leaf while her body was so cold. Hannah immediately jumped from her bed and approached Iris. Panic and concern filled her eyes. She had been trying to find her for the past few days and get any information about her whereabouts, but the only thing that she could gather was the fact that Iris was in the Alpha's bedroom. That was why the mistress looked so agitated, as if she would throw a punch at anyone who made even a trivial mistake. But no one knew whether she was still alive or not. She was thinking of going to the Alpha in the morning, but now she saw her dear Missy standing at the door, hugging herself and looking so miserable.
Oh, my dear, where have you been?
Hannah immediately rushed toward Iris and hugged her close. Once Iris felt the warmth of Hannah's arms around her, the only person that she knew wouldn't put her in harm's way, she broke down into tears in an instant. She felt exhausted. She had dragged her tired body to this room in fear that Kane would change his mind and throw her to those savages regardless. She was afraid for her life and what would happen to her. Her future was so bleak.
Hannah! Hannah!
Iris kept crying, bawling her eyes out until her voice turned hoarse and her throat was in pain. Her ears kept ringing because of the strangulation, and she was in so much pain, physically and mentally.
It's okay, my dear. It's okay.
Hannah hugged her tighter to give her a sense of protection that she was not alone. She was not alone in this world, and she would do whatever to keep her safe, though what she could do was very limited. They stayed like that until past midnight, and Iris had slightly calmed down, probably because she was so tired after bawling her eyes out. Though she didn't say anything about what had happened to her, what the Alpha had done to her, and why he confined her for days, Hannah knew better than to ask.
I will run a bath for you. A warm bath will help you to calm down better, okay?
Hannah said. Thankfully, this room had a small bathroom and a small bathtub inside, which was the only comfort that Hannah could offer to Iris. She nodded, thinking a warm bath would feel good, since she had not yet taken one for days. But then, when Hannah had prepared everything and even sprinkled flower petals that she could find in the garden, Iris remembered about the mark on her neck.
I want to bathe myself.
She said.
I want to be alone.
At first, Hannah didn't agree. But then when she saw how disturbed Iris looked and how she desperately wanted some alone time, she backed down.
I will be right here if you need anything, okay?
She cupped her face, making sure that she understood what she was saying. Iris nodded and then stepped back as she closed the bathroom door. Once she was alone and was sure that Hannah wouldn't come back into the bathroom, Iris slowly stripped off her dress and looked at her body. There was a blurry mirror in the bathroom where she could see her mark closely and felt a lump forming in her throat. Around her neck, bruises started to form, and it wouldn't look good in the morning. If Hannah noticed this, she would make a fuss over it. Iris sighed. She felt so tired as she walked toward the bathtub and dipped herself in the water. The tub was so small she needed to fold her legs, but the warm water felt so nice against her skin. Iris looked at her arms and saw more bruises. The Alpha indeed didn't care to be gentle with her. Why would he? In the end, Iris stayed there until the water became cold and Hannah knocked on the door to check on her condition. Iris got a fever after she returned, but Hannah found the healer again and asked for her help. Even though she did it reluctantly, she helped her. Therefore, today, when Iris felt slightly better, she returned to the mines, despite Hannah telling her to take more rest.
No, I don't want to be left alone in the room.
She was mortified that the Alpha would call her and punish her, though if he wanted to do that, working in the mines wouldn't save her from him. Because of that very reason, and how Hannah failed to make sure she stayed on the bed, here she was, under the scorching sun. Iris found one magic stone, which she hid under her belt. The Alpha took her magic stone and the book, thus she couldn't figure out anything yet, but she could still feel the magic stones that surrounded her. She could feel them, and there were a lot. The more she spent her time in the mines, the more sensitive she was. This was also one of the reasons why she wanted to come back here. Easily, Iris found another stone and sneaked it into her belt again as she thought 2 was enough. The next time she found the third one, she would hand it over and get herself a nice and warm meal. She intended to go to the library again tonight and wished that she wouldn't find anyone having sex there. And that was what she did. After the sun set and she showed 2 magic stones to Stone, who looked at her, baffled, she got a warm meal and a little chunk of meat.
How can you find those magic stones?
Stone asked her in his gruff tone. He had worked in the mines before. As it wasn't an everyday occurrence, he knew how hard it was to find a stone, let alone 2 in a day. His jaw probably would have dropped if he were to know that Iris actually found 4, 7 in total, since she started working on this site.
I don't know. I just found it.
Iris munched on her little meat and drank her warm soup, staring at him innocently. He obviously didn't believe her. Later that night, after Iris made sure that Hannah had fallen asleep, she sneaked out of the bedroom and walked toward the library. She used to do this, even when her father was still the Alpha. Thus, she was familiar with the best places to hide and how to avoid the patrolling guards. Once she was in the library, Iris knew which shelves that she should go to and found the book rather quickly than the last time she was there. Iris came to this place with 2 magic stones that she got that day and started to look for what kind of stones were those. However, when she perused the book, from the corner of her eye, she caught a book title that made her stop reading as she lifted her head to look at that book closely. It was a book about ancient creatures. For some reason, Iris was intrigued and pulled it out from the shelf and started perusing it briefly. Her fingers stopped flipping the pages when she gasped to see the illustration of a lycan, the monster that she saw in the basement of the rickety hut, the monster that the Alpha had shifted into. It was a lycan, a cursed shifter who had performed dark magic.
Impossible.
Iris stared at the description of it, but she couldn't find many things here, aside from a lycan was a shifter who had broken the rule of nature and tried to use magic, which was a power that didn't belong to them in the first place. Therefore, as punishment, they would turn into a lycan, the cursed shifter, every new moon. Iris lifted her head and tried to think what night that day was, and she gasped in shock. It was indeed a new moon.
Your curiosity knows no bounds.
The book and 2 magic stones dropped to the floor at the sound of Kane's voice that rang inside this quiet library. Iris didn't know that she was not alone until he came into her peripheral vision. She blanched at the sight of him. Meanwhile, one of the magic stones rolled on the floor and stopped right under Kane's shoe. He bent down to take it and inspected the magic stone.
You sneak this out again.
Kane's dark eyes fell on Iris as she took a step back to put a distance between them. It was her instinct to be away from the Alpha because he emanated danger for her.
I found 4 today, and I gave 2 to the slave trainer.
And you think it is justified for you to keep the other 2?
Iris couldn't answer that, but she couldn't not look at him, just in case he was saying something and she missed it. She didn't want to upset him after what happened. And before she answered the question, Kane picked the book from the ground and started to look through it. From the title alone, he knew what kind of book Iris was reading.
A lycan.
Kane picked the second magic stone and then put the book on the table, as he was only a step away from Iris. She couldn't take another step back because her back was already pressing against the bookshelf.
What have you learned?
Iris cleared her throat and answered his question honestly based on what she had read earlier.
It was a lycan. The monster that I saw was a lycan. Did you perform dark magic?
She asked gingerly. This time, she looked him in the eyes, so she would be able to see his reaction. But his expression remained unreadable. Kane closed the distance between them again, until he was only a hair's breadth away from her, and he stared down at her neck, which was covered by her curly hair. She had let loose her hair in order to cover her neck, since none of the dresses she owned had a high collar. He brushed away her hair to see his mark on her, and she flinched when the tips of his fingers grazed her skin. He could also see the bruises on her neck from when he tried to strangle her. The mark was so glaring now that the skin had healed from the biting. He glared at it with so much hostility. But then, when he blinked his eyes, it disappeared. His expression turned to being stoic.
Have you told anyone about this?
Iris immediately shook her head.
Not even Hannah saw the mark.
Kane said nothing. He dropped the 2 magic stones into her hand and then walked away from her, leaving her inside the library alone. Iris was not sure whether she had to follow him or not, but seeing the magic stones in her hand that he handed over again to her, she took it as him not minding her keeping them. After all, he took her magic stone last time. And so, Iris spent many hours inside the library perusing the books with no one bothering her. She ended up learning a few interesting things about magic stones and was fascinated by it. But then, the most interesting part was when she found a book about the lycans and everything that entailed the curse, how to deal with the curse and how to help a shifter when the new moon came. She was not sure whether Kane knew about this or not, but she wanted to let him know if she had a chance. Especially the part where the curse for the lycan could be lifted by a seraphim. It was the title for a woman who held a great divine power, but such a person lived on a different continent.
Did the Alpha know about this? The curse can be cured.
Episode 45. They were out of options.
Did the Alpha know about this? The curse can be cured.
Iris muttered to herself as she held the book close to her chest, thinking of how to tell him about this. Seraphim came to this continent 15 years ago for the royal wedding of the king and the queen. At that time, King Aeon and Queen Della were only the crown prince and the crown princess. Their succession to the throne had left bad blood within the royal family, but fortunately, Kane's mother was left out of it because she stayed away from the capital and followed her mate back to the Howling Wolf pack. She didn't give any indication that she wanted to be crowned as the heir. That was why she was the only half-sibling that survived. But it was no longer the case now, since Alpha Gerald killed her along with her husband. Iris learned about all of this from her teacher when she was 10 years old, and she remembered how proud he was when he explained to a 10-year-old girl the gory scene that was the death of Kane's parents. He told her in detail, despite Iris having tears in her eyes, not wanting to know about that. He made sure she read his lips and knew what he was talking about. Iris wanted to read more, but then she would have to spend a lot of time in this library, and she needed to get some sleep before she went to work in the mines the next day. But then, she realized that she was attracting unwanted attention by finding these magic stones easily, so she wouldn't find any stones tomorrow, which meant there would be no warm meal for her. She was not sure whether she had to hide this fact or not.
The Queen said that the king is planning to put one of his people in charge of the Blue Moon Pack, and he has gotten the 5 alphas to approve the same.
Adaran reported this information to his alpha. Today would be the last day of their meeting, and the king would announce his decision about the fate of the Blue Moon Pack, as he was against the idea of merging the 2 packs together, since it would make Kane the alpha of 2 packs. The other 5 alphas supported the king's decision.
What should we do?
Adaran asked in a concerned voice. They would be damned to let those wicked people from the Blue Moon Pack that had been involved in torturing them to be free and taste their freedom again. Most of the people in the Howling Wolf Pack demanded Kane to kill them all if things had come to that. Why would the king meddle in their business when he turned a blind eye while they were enslaved for a decade? The king didn't have any right to get involved. Kane shared the same sentiment. His uncle shouldn't have bothered to come all the way to the Blue Moon Pack. He should have sat quietly on his throne.
What about the messengers?
Kane turned his head to talk to Will, who was walking on his left side.
They were supposed to arrive this noon. 5 of them had returned, but 2 messengers were still on their way here.
Will reported the situation, and Kane only nodded. They didn't slow down their steps towards the strategy room, where they held the meeting. The 5 alphas had been waiting for them. The king would arrive last. Once Kane stepped into the room, he saw the alphas were sitting on their respective seats, while their betas and gammas stood a step behind their alphas. The tension was so thick as they awaited the final decision that would seal the fate of the Blue Moon Pack. They would fight tooth and nail for this pack to not be merged with Howling Wolf Pack, because aside from all the benefits that Kane would get, he would monopolize the mines all by himself if that happened. Jace and Ethan immediately approached Kane and stood behind him when he sat down on his seat. The room was so quiet. It was so different from the day of the introduction a week ago.
Ask Will to find Iris and bring her here on my order.
Kane mind-linked the beta. Gerald had done something to Kane in his slavery days, which severed the mind link between the members of the Howling Wolf Pack. He forced them all to drink poison, which cut the ties between one another, to weaken their unity. But only recently Kane managed to mend the severed bonds. But it was only with his beta and gamma. They couldn't use it if they were more than 3 steps away from each other. Jace immediately walked towards the door and talked to Will about what the alpha had ordered him to do.
Why should we get that girl?
Will frowned so hard. He thought this matter had nothing to do with her.
Just do what you're told.
Jace said and then patted his back.
Go.
Will didn't have any other choice and left the premises to go to the mines, where Iris would be at this hour. Not long after that, the king arrived, and the final discussion about the fate of the Blue Moon Pack would be decided now. Not far from Iris, Will was standing with his arms folded in front of his chest, staring at her with a stoic expression. People tended to look at her this way if they were not directing a hostile gaze at her, thus she was used to it.
You need to come with me.
Will said once Iris looked at him.
Now.
He added when Iris didn't move.
Where to?
Iris asked. She stood up and dusted her dirty dress off the debris.
This is the Alpha's order.
Will replied. That was enough reason for Iris to stop asking about anything. If this was the Alpha's order, then she couldn't afford to make him wait for long. She was afraid that he would show his temper. Iris finally went with Will, and as usual, she had to half run to keep up with his long legs as he walked so fast. She almost felt like there was something chasing them. But this was his normal gait. Most of the shifters walked like this, and if anyone had to be blamed, it was Iris for having short legs.
Me, as the judge of this ordeal, will make the decision based on the majority of votes, and all the Alphas have agreed to this.
King Aeon started his speech.
Based on the majority of votes, we agreed not to merge the two packs together, and I will restore Mason's status as the Alpha of the pack.
Ethan and Jace were seething when they heard that. They were visibly upset with that declaration. But Kane looked so calm as ever.
Mason can't be the Alpha of the pack.
Kane said calmly as he leaned his back against his seat and stared at the king. He didn't taunt him by calling him my uncle again, because it was not wise to aggravate him in this situation. No matter what, he was still the king.
He still has a lot to learn about leadership, yes, but he is the Alpha's son. The title will be passed down to him.
The king looked at Kane smugly, knowing that he couldn't retaliate, and this was a basic rule for shifters like them. They didn't really have a say in it. However, Kane shook his head and then told Jace to do something. The beta walked out of the room and returned with Adoran, who dragged Mason into the room to join this meeting. Kane was aware that there would be a slight possibility that he would win this case. Therefore, he had a backup plan or two at his disposal.
Outrageous! Why did you bring him to this meeting?
Alpha Gil stood up and glared at Kane to see a naked Mason being dragged into the center of their attention. He was gagged, unable to speak, with both of his hands tied behind his back while chains limited his leg movements.
Calm down!
The king was furious. He pounded his fist on the table. He glared at Alpha Gil until he yielded and sat down again. After that, he shifted his displeasure toward Kane.
What is the meaning of this?
I brought him here just in case all of you have forgotten that he is not qualified to be an Alpha.
Kane stood up and walked towards Mason. His eyes flared with anger, but Kane didn't care. He received that anger gladly, since he was having the upper hand this time. He could have him killed if he wanted to.
Restore his status and he will get his people to help him maintain the pack.
Alpha James from Bloody Wolf Pack shouted.
He was a prisoner, yes, but the king has restored his status. You should treat him with respect.
No, the decision has not been made yet.
Kane then kicked Mason, so he would roll over and show his private part.
I think all of you forgot about this tiny little fact.
All of them glared at Mason, who was so exposed for them to see. But none of them talked. Thus, Kane broke the silence.
He has been castrated. There is no way for him to produce an heir.
Kane looked at all of them one by one, as the realization dawned on them and they started to understand where this was going. For the Alpha, even though you were a firstborn, if you couldn't produce an heir, then it would be the end of your reign.
That's your fault to have him castrated. He can adopt and raise an heir to be his own.
Yet, no matter what excuses that they threw at Kane, they knew they were baseless, and the king couldn't disagree with Kane. That was the importance of an heir.
You should be punished for castrating the heir to the Alpha title.
Alpha Gian from Silver River Pack was outraged.
Punish me?
Kane tilted his head and directed his hatred toward the Alpha, who immediately clamped his mouth shut.
He is a war prisoner. There is a rule that the Conqueror can do whatever to their war prisoners, and even now, he is still a war prisoner, until the king says otherwise.
But then, for the king to say otherwise was not easy, because there was another rule that he had to consider. And moreover, That was the same excuse that those alphas and the king used a decade ago when Cain asked for help when he and his people were enslaved and were treated no different from dirt. Even though Cain didn't say it out loud, they knew that they couldn't dispute this, since it would project them in a bad light for their previous actions.
He can't produce a child. He can't be an option anymore.
Cain had erased that option straight away.
You can just remind us of this. You don't need to present him naked like that.
The king narrowed his eyes to see Mason's condition. He met him once when he went to the capital. He was a bright, cunning, and wicked child, but right now, he was nothing but a sorry creature. Cain said nothing against that statement. He knew that he could remind them about this, but then where would be the fun in that? Weren't they always looking for something fun? How funny it was when they laughed at Mason as he was being humiliated in the welcoming party. But right now, they wanted him to be the alpha because they feared the power that Cain would hold.
In this case, we need...
Alpha Gil was about to offer a solution, but Cain didn't allow him to talk.
He is not the only child that Alpha Gerald has.
Cain looked at Jace, and he nodded before walking away from the room. The Beta and Gamma started to realize what Cain had planned, and they didn't know how to feel about this. This was not a good idea, but they were out of options.